Let's get back to domestic issues here, and I want to talk to Jacinta Price, who heads up the Indigenous Studies area for the Centre for Independent Studies. And she joins us from, I was going to say from Alice Spring. I'm not so certain, Jacinta, where I'm catching up with you from, but I want to talk to you about your thoughts on the national curriculum. You're in Toowoomba. So
I am.
Now, you wrote for the Daily Telegraph, or you were quoted in the Daily Telegraph today talking about the national curriculum. You said it's dangerous because of the way it might revise the teaching of history, particularly Indigenous history. Tell us why it's dangerous.
Well, we're already seeing it happen when it comes to Indigenous culture, what's going on, what went on historically. There's a total rewriting of history and rewriting of culture going on nationally, and a romanticism of our history and of our culture taking place. So this is to me is what will be put in place of what's currently being taught. I'm all for, my father is an ex-history teacher and an ex-English teacher. In fact, my parents are both former teachers. And I'm all for learning about our country's history, learning about things like, my family were affected by the Coniston Massacre. There were people who were alive who could tell me about, the fact that they were babies in their mum's arms when it took place in my part of the world and in my part of the country. But and my family commemorated that event and invited the descendants of those who took part in killing my family to say, look, we recognise these were difficult times in our history. They were hard, but we have forgiven, we've moved on, we've moved forward, but we want everyone to know what happened. Not many people know about that, and I think it's important to teach those sorts of things, but I don't believe in teaching ideology and indoctrinating our children further to think that if you're a white Australian kid, somehow you're responsible for things like the Coniston Massacre that occurred with my own family, that somehow you've got to repent for the sins of the colour of your skin. And we're seeing that already happening. And I just see this as a way for this indoctrination to be further applied, and it's extremely dangerous.
Yeah, it's very complex, but I mean, there's an important point here, and that is that we need to teach the Indigenous history of this country. In days gone by, it wasn't taught. I know a lot of people of my vintage say they learnt nothing at school. I must have been lucky because we learned a lot about Indigenous history, even in primary school and through senior school. Although I look back on it now, and what I know now, we didn't learn enough about some of the atrocities such as you've referred to. But now we've gone too far the other way. If we're teaching, as you say, critical race theory or teaching it in an ideological way, we need to teach realistic, straightforward history of Indigenous Australia, the positives as well as the negatives. And we need to make sure we don't push out the teaching of other things like Western civilisation and the traditions of democracy and rule of law that are embedded in our country now as well.
That's right. We can't sacrifice those sorts of things for other, for certainly not for ideology, that's for sure. We should be certainly adding to our curriculum those elements of our history that we haven't learnt that much about, but certainly not removing what our Western civilization was built on, that we have all benefited from in this nation to make this nation the wonderful nation that it is today, and that many of us, it is part of our history. People like myself of mixed Indigenous, white Australian heritage, it is part of who we are as much as the Indigenous side of us as well. And we can't ignore that. These are facts. This is the truth. And what I don't want is for lies to get in the way. Rewriting history, rewriting, culture, Aboriginal culture, attempting to say that we were somehow agriculturalists, is utterly untrue. And when it comes to Aboriginal people still living by traditional cultural, on traditional cultural terms, if you ask anyone from who are currently living it, they will tell you we weren't agriculturalists historically, but unfortunately this is already being taught in our schools.
This is the trouble, the whole Bruce Pascoe sort of thing, because it suits a particular ideological narrative. It's taught as fact, and people are believing and teaching what they want to be true. We ought to stick with the facts, shouldn't we?
We've got to stick with the facts. You know, the facts don't lie. We've got to teach the truth, and we've got to have a sense of pride in our nation also. You know, when we're confronted with huge issues like we're going to be up against China fairly soon, we've got to be able to have pride in our country that we can stand together, that we can band together in the face of anything that might go wrong. I mean, we've just had COVID. We've seen what, you know, the devastation across the world, within our own country, these sorts of things. We need to maintain a sense of pride in our nation and our shared Australian culture that was brought together by all of us from many different backgrounds. We've got to celebrate in these things as well. So I'm hoping that the new curriculum is actually going to encourage those sorts of things and not more of the division that we've seen so far.
Spot on, Jacinta. Always good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Jacinta Price there, who's the Director of Indigenous Research at the Centre for Independent Studies.